Hi, I'm Dave Rumore, Chief Revenue Officer at Future Technologies. Welcome to the latest in a series of podcasts here at Team Future Tech. Today's topic is the Rural Digital Opportunity Fund, or RDOF, and joining us is Steve Coran. Steve is a communications attorney with the Washington, D.C. law firm of Lerman Center. He's an expert on broadband, internet governance, spectrum, and all things FCC. Welcome, Steve.
Thanks, Dave. Happy to be here.
Great. I guess with all your experience with the Connect America Fund, this must feel like deja vu all over again.
Well, there are a lot of similarities between the Connect America Fund and the Rural Digital Opportunity Fund. This is a bit bigger. It's $20.4 billion, with $16 billion of that going on the auction block beginning in October. And the timing of this on May 21st is incredibly fortuitous, given that we have a much better insight into what those auction procedures are going to look like, and looking forward to sharing those with the folks today.
Great. And I'm sure there's lessons learned from Connect America that you can relate to as well.
Exactly.
Before you get started with the presentation, why don't you describe your involvement in the RDOF process?
Well, it really goes back to when the FCC began putting the Connect America Fund together back in 2011. Hard to believe we've been at this for 9 years, but we have. And working with the Wireless Internet Service Providers Association, WISPA, to help get the FCC's rules and auction procedures on good footing there, and made a lot of progress that made it easier for smaller companies, whether they're broadband companies or electric transmission or distribution companies, to participate. So that was a real good lesson for participating in RDOF. For RDOF, WISPA has been involved in every phase of the rulemaking process and the auction procedures process. And between the overlap with dealing with the CAF winners and what they've had to go through, that has informed a lot of the advocacy we put into RDOF on things like letters of credit, which we're going to talk a little bit about, and the application process itself. It's going to look a lot like the Connect America Fund, but it will also, there are some differences here that folks really need to understand.
Okay, very good. Well, I'm going to let you jump right in, Steve, so take it away.
Okay, great. So you could advance the slide.
And my slide is not advancing. Terrific. There we go.
There we go. There we go. So RDOF got its start back in August of 2019 when the FCC put out a notice of proposed rulemaking. This was originally supposed to be CAF 3, but it was renamed the Rural Digital Opportunity Fund. As I just mentioned, it's $20.4 billion. Phase 1 is $16 billion, up to $16 billion, I should say, and those are for census blocks that lack 25 by 3 megabit service. The FCC proposed to award support by a multiple round reverse auction procedure that looks a lot like CAF Phase 2. A couple questions the FCC asked was whether they should require subscription metrics. In other words, you have to, in addition to having build-out milestones and speed and latency testing and reporting, is whether you had to hook up a minimum number of customers over the years. And then the FCC also proposed to make some changes to its CAF Phase 2 performance tiers, which were 10 by 1, 25 by 3, 100 by 20, and gigabit. So one of the proposals was to get rid of the 10 by 1 tier at the bottom. It wasn't very popular anyway, and have the lowest tier be 25 by 3. So that's where the FCC started, and we will see as we go to the next slide what the where we went from there. So February 7th, about 3 months ago, the FCC put out its report and order, and this is the rules it adopted for for the auction. There was a big push by a lot of folks to get performance bonds because the letter of credit rules had been proved to be very burdensome for CAF winners. The way it works is for your first year of support, you need to get a letter of credit equal to that amount. And in the second year, your letter of credit would cover that amount plus year 2. And in year 3, it would cover all the money that had been dispersed in years 1 and 2, plus the amount in year 3, and so far up to year 6. So if you're paying 5% of that money, give or take, in bank fees, that's a lot of money in the out years that you're giving just to the banks that aren't going to deployment, at the same time that you're less of a credit risk to the FCC because you're actually building. You haven't taken off for Tahiti. So there was a lot of effort by WISPA and by the U.S. Telecom and other associations, including Enrica, to lower the value of those of the letter of credit. And that's a significant difference between CAF2 and RDOF. You'll never have to carry more than 3 years instead of 6, and even then, that's only if you default. And most if you're in compliance, the most you're going to have to carry is 2 years. And if you hit a 20% build-out milestone that's optional by the second year, the most you're going to have to carry is 1 year of a letter of credit, so long as you're not in.
Okay.
Deployment and not to bank fees. The FCC also did not require a subscription metric. The feeling was from a lot of commenters that this was going to dissuade participation if you had to actually hit numbers. And, what do we do about the threat from things like SpaceX or other competitors? Or what if we have another pandemic and you just can't hit a 70% number by year 6? There may be people who don't want to buy broadband at all. So why should you be responsible for dictating their habits, assume financial risk with that? Another thing that's different is if you are a CAF Phase 2 winner, or really any kind of a high-cost winner, you're dealing with the FCC's estimate of locations that has been found to be anything but precise. They used models created 6 or 7 years ago that estimated how many locations there are in a particular census block. But it didn't tell you where those locations are. And if you're doing fiber, that's a big deal. There's a big difference between serving somebody at the mailbox and serving somebody's house that may be a quarter mile down the road or even further, especially in some of these larger Midwest and Western census blocks. So, the number was also in a lot of places, the FCC overestimated the number of census blocks. So the FCC wants to get this right, and you want to get it right too, because if you're bidding, you have to make certifications that you're hitting build-out milestones. Well, if your denominator is lower than the FCC's denominator, you've got a problem there. So there's a process that the FCC will be going through to true up the number of locations. And the good news is there's about a 35% buffer on either side of the FCC's beginning number, what's referred to as the CAM model number. So if it ends up being 35% or less higher or 35% lower for the actual number of locations, there's no pro rata give back of any money, nor will you get any more money either out of the fund. The thing that the FCC did is instead of having 3 performance tiers, we now have 4. So a 50 by 5 tier was added, and we'll come to that in a slide or two. Another interesting thing that's different is that there's a clearing round bid processing mechanism. And I don't want to get too far in the weeds on how the auction actually works, but the auction will begin not at 16 billion, but at some higher number. And then it will walk down in what's referred to as a descending clock design by 5 or 10%. And then once we hit 16 billion, we have a good auction. And that means the FCC can start assigning bids. And so if you're the only bidder in a particular area, that's the point where you are going to be assigned a particular winning bid, even as competitive markets continue to go back and forth. With the clearing round bid processing mechanism, if you have kind of the best score, what's referred to as the lowest weighted performance and latency tiers, you will be given a preference at the clearing round, as against folks who have sort of slower speeds or higher latency. And then finally, the FCC announced that it was pushing its auction back 1 week from October 22nd to October 29. So that's sort of the good news. The bad news, I guess, if it is bad news, is the short form deadline is going to be from July 1 to July 15. I think a lot of folks, me included, thought it was not going to be until August, and folks time see, for reasons we'll discuss in a little bit, wants to have more time to vet the applications and determine whether you're qualified to bid a particular tier and ask a bunch of questions.
And those dates are current as of communication from the FCC this week, right?
Yes, on Tuesday. So we'll come to that. But yeah, we expect on June the 9th that the FCC is going to be voting on the auction procedures. Shortly thereafter will be the final list of eligible census blocks. The FCC right now is dealing with a number of challenges, basically an updating process from Form 477. It's turned into a bit more than that, but the idea is that if you added, if you upgraded to 25.3, or you expanded your service, or you added voice service, that you could now seek to exclude additional census blocks from the auction. And I think the FCC got a little bit more than it asked for when it asked folks to submit information indicating that there were certain census blocks that should be taken off the market. So they're going through that process now. Long way of saying that the FCC still has some work to do between now and June 9th or so forth, but the final list will be out just probably 2 or 3 weeks before the short form deadline occurs, maybe a month before it actually closes. So folks really need to get on that information very quickly so that they can figure out where they want to bid.
Okay.
So let's roll to the next slide here. So these are the performance tiers that the FCC adopted in the February 7th order. What you want to do here is you want to try and get as far, you want to get as close to 0 as you can. So if you are bidding at a gigabit down and 500 megs up with low latency, then you will get 0 points. If you are at 100 by 20 with low latency, you're going to have a weight applied to your bid. And what you're bidding when you bid is you're bidding a percentage of the reserve price for that particular census block. So that's a 20-point hit on that bid. And then so far, so on and so forth. 50 by 5 is a 35-point weight. And then at 25.3, you get a 50-point weight. High latency and low latency, I think most folks will be at low latency. High latency is more for satellite, and that's a fairly large penalty, and it's a bigger penalty than what we saw in CAF 2, where it was only 25. Okay, so we can talk a little bit about post-auction obligations, simply because this is not a free lunch. There is a lot of stuff that needs to happen once you've won. We'll circle back and talk about the application process a little bit, and I know Dave has some questions on that. But the post-auction obligations, once you have won, you then have to file what's referred to as a long-form application, and this has much more detailed financial information, including a letter of credit commitment letter and audited financials that you have to submit. You have to become an eligible telecommunications carrier at the state level, so that involves kind of a state process in most places. You have to provide a lot of technical information and network information, basically to tell the FCC that you're going to do this and that you can do it. You're going to have to submit, as we talked about before, a letter of credit, but it's at a much lower amount than what we saw for CAF Phase 2. FCC wisely decided that to lower the premium on their policy, as I like to say, and realize that there are going to be more people who default because they can't get an expensive letter of credit in years 3, 4, 5, and 6 than there will for folks who miss these milestones. And your letter of credit is only at risk if you fail to hit these build-out milestones. And these are percentages of locations. So 40% by year 3, 60% year 4, 80% year 5, and you have to hit 100% of those locations at the end of year 6. And the locations we're talking about are the ones that the FCC identifies before the auction. Now, if the FCC in their 6-year true-up determines that there's additional locations you have to serve, you can do that by the end of year 8. You can get out from underneath your letter of credit and retire that at the end of year 6 by hitting 100% of those initially designated locations. There's extensive speed and latency testing. I have a whole deck on that maybe we'll do another time, but you have to be able to quarterly test for the speed and the latency tiers that you obligated to provide when you filed your short form application. So for instance, you have to hit, if you're at 100 by 20, you have to hit 80% of the upload and download speeds 80% of the time, and you have to be at 100 milliseconds or less 95% of the time.
And you have to provide documentation supporting that?
Correct. You test quarterly and you submit your results on an annual basis. You can't trim, you can't edit, you can't give them some of the results. It's basically everything. Now, what they will probably be is kind of a dry run or a trial period where you submit results, but they don't count. We did a lot of work last year to get the FCC's rules better because their testing rules were, quite frankly, a bit of a mess when they first came out. So we did a lot of work with some other groups to get the FCC to modify those rules so they are not perfect, but much more user-friendly. One of the issues was, where do you test to? Point A, point B, back to point A. And so there was a fair amount of discussion about what IXP you need to test through. And again, there's a lot of detail here that we won't go into, but it's really, really important. There are companies out there that are making testing equipment that they say is available. And if you do participate in this, I would encourage you to look into that ahead of time. Also encourage you to do mapping on the front end. We talked before about how some of the FCC's data just says there's 25 locations in this census block. Well, you don't know if that number is true and you don't know where they are. It's a really, really good idea to get ahead of the curve. And before the auction starts, if you can, get that mapping data under control so that you're not sort of putting your finger in the air and figuring out which way the wind blows and say, well, if the FCC says it's 25, then that's close enough for me. Because especially when you're doing fiber deployments, that can be a really big deal and will affect your cost model and dictate how much support you actually need to complement your own funds. So you also are going to need to report those locations in the hub. You're going to need to make financial certifications that you're using the money for its intended purpose, which is the provision, maintenance, and upgrade of services and facilities. And then there's, compliance. The FCC can suspend a portion of the payment if you're not hitting your speed and latency marks. It can ultimately, if you don't hit your build-out milestones by 50%. So if in year 3 you're below 20%, they can start suspending your money. So these are really important things to know because RDOF isn't for everyone, but it can be a really great thing. And I can talk to you a little bit later about some of the success stories that we're starting to see in CAF 2. Okay. Next one. All right, so we talked about the draft auction procedures that came out just on Tuesday, and I suspect that they will be adopted more or less in the form that they're in. So the FCC's auction is going to be a multi-round reverse auction, which means that they will start at the level of support, and whoever takes the least amount of support with those weights that we talked about before is ultimately going to be the successful bidder. They say, the FCC likes to say technology neutral, but we all know that fiber costs more money and fiber can go faster than just about every other technology. So the rub there is that you may get a zero preference, but you may not be able to take the support level down as low where it still supports a business model for fiber. That's just one example. The FCC is going to undertake a case-by-case review of the short form applications that are going to be due by July 15th. And one of the things the FCC decided was that fixed wireless technologies can bid at the gigabit tier if they can demonstrate a reasonable capability of hitting gigabit. There are some new millimeter wave spectrum that's been made available in the last couple of years through auction or on an unlicensed basis. There are companies out there that are making fixed wireless gear at, say, 60 gigahertz that can do this sort of thing. Granted, not over long distances, and that's one of the things the FCC wants to vet. It's also one of the reasons why I think the FCC has an extended vetting period from July 15th until the auction begins, not until the end of October. Decide whether they should call. Satellite is not permitted to bid at the gigabit or the low latency. And we do expect that SpaceX, for instance, which was lobbying pretty hard, is going to continue to advocate for getting better rules so it can better compete in this auction.
Right. Steve, could you describe the short form process a bit?
So the short form process is a Form 175 that's electronic. The elements of it are disclosure of your ownership. That can be rather extensive or can be rather simple. Disclosure of any agreements that affect your bids or bidding strategies, or the post-auction market structure. So, and keep in mind that the FCC does not allow you to change ownership in a major way during the auction. It also doesn't allow any sort of joint bidding arrangements. It will allow joint ventures. So I know in the CAF auction, there were 30 plus rural electric cooperatives that formed a consortium. They bid together, and then they were allowed to split those bids up after the auction was over and get the ability to operate their own networks.
So a smaller utility with limited resources could join a consortium and kind of pool resources to put a bid together.
Exactly. So you pool resources. I would be a little bit careful because you need to make sure if you're in a consortium who's in charge and how you're going to spend your money. And what if someone isn't available, or what if someone decides they don't want to do it anymore? So the governance of consortium is something you really need to think about before you crawl into something like this. But yes, having the same consultant, the same legal counsel, being able to bid one time is a really good thing. The other elements are you pick the areas where you want to bid. You also have to answer a whole bunch of operational questions to tell the FCC that, try to convince the FCC that you've done your homework. You know what a network is, you know what fiber is, you know what fixed wireless is, you've done some, if you're doing a fixed wireless thing, you've identified the spectrum bands that you are going to show that are available for the next 10 years. It's a really, really important part, and it's the thing that the FCC is going to pay really close attention to when it decides whether you're eligible to bid, and if so, at what tier. And just because you say, I can do a gigabit, that's not good enough. You're going to have to be able to show the FCC how you're going to do that and what technologies you can do that with and what the capabilities of those technologies are. Now, granted, you don't know where you're going to win and where you're not going to win, so market-specific information is not something the FCC is going to look for. They don't want propagation maps or fiber route maps or anything like that. That's a very time-consuming part of the application process. So those are kind of the 4 or 5 categories of things that you need to be prepared for in the short form application. The other thing to keep in mind is that once you file a short form application, you are subject to anti-collusion rules, or what's also referred to as prohibited communication rules. And that prevents you from, and anybody within your company, from communicating with another bidder about the bids or bidding strategies that you're going to employ. The only thing you can say is, yes, I filed a short form application. You can't say, yes, I'm planning to bid. You can't say, I'm out of the bidding. You can't say, I'm going to be the biggest winner that there ever will be in this thing because X, Y, Z. So you need to be really, really careful. And the thing that I worry about is some employee who is walking by your office who gets together with his buddy to have a beer, and his buddy works for some competitor down the street, and they've known each other for years because they've been, in the tech space for years, and somebody says something to somebody else, or something appears in the media, or you say something to a financial analyst and he publishes something. So it's all these other sort of indirect ways of communicating your bids or bidding strategies that becomes a problem. And there's an obligation on both the party making the prohibited communication and the party receiving it to disclose that information to the FCC within 5 days. So it's a really, really important thing. It also is going to prevent you in a lot of ways from having discussions if you want to do a transaction. You want to acquire a neighbor, you want to buy out a competitor. Well, if you're both bidding in the auction, you probably can't have those discussions because it will inherently involve bids or bidding strategies or post-auction market structure. So think about the opportunity costs of participating in this auction if you want to do a transaction. Those are things that we've had, there are ways that you can work around this sometimes, but not always. So you're going to need to get some legal advice if you have a transaction that you may be discussing even now and you want to participate in this auction. So when you participate in the auction, now we're talking about the auction itself. You can't switch areas after the clearing round. You can only bid in the areas that you're bidding on at that time. You can also do something called package bidding, which is bidding on a number of census blocks as a group. And you will have some transparency. You will know during the auction what the lowest T plus L, that's your speed plus latency weight, is for the previous round. So those are a couple of things that are a little bit different from than what we saw in the CAF Phase 2 auction.
So you mentioned earlier that this program isn't for everyone. Why shouldn't a company participate?
If you do acquire, well, first of all, is the one I just mentioned, the opportunity cost of being tied up in a quiet period from July until probably November or December. So it's really going to chill your ability to have M&A discussions, or discuss with neighbors things that might be related to what happens after the auction, if we win or if we win or something. So that's kind of number one. Number two is there's a lot of reporting and compliance, and there's a lot of money you're going to have to spend even before you get the FCC's money. You're going to have engineering costs, you're going to have legal costs, both for FCC work as well as at the state level. To get your eligible telecommunications carrier designation. You're going to need to do mapping. You're going to need to hire people. So you should plan on spending, I've told people, maybe $200,000 before you get your first check from the FCC. It may not be that much. It depends on how many states you're in. It depends on where you're going for your engineering. It depends on what your bank fees are going to be for the letter of credit. But it's a sizable expense. So that's kind of number two. Number three is scale. If you win, and you win in a big way that's going to require you to expand your network, you got to be prepared to hire people, hire them quickly, build towers, string fiber, trench fiber. You're going to need to, be prepared to do that, and you're going to need to hire the workforce. And in many respects, you may know everybody who works in your company now, but if you take on a lot of money, you're going to have to set up layers of hierarchy and communication lines and reporting lines that are a little bit different. And for some folks, they may not be willing to take on, the scalability that's going to be required, especially if you take on a lot of money. And I would say this: if you're only in this to do something marginal, you may not want to do it, because you're going to have a lot of costs for compliance, and the costs for compliance are going to be relatively the same if you're a $1 million winner versus a $10 million winner versus a $100 million winner. It won't proceed in the same sort of exponential fact. It'll be a little bit more, but not that much more, if you're comparing kind of those three tiers of winning. The other one is just sort of, do you really want the government to be your business partner? Because that's really what they are. They're your banker, they're your compliance officer. They're basically judge, jury, and executioner. So a lot of people are just turned off by that. Other people are not. So that's kind of a personal choice as to whether you want to have a 10-year relationship with the FCC and with your state government, and also be subject to congressional scrutiny if things go south, or if members of Congress want to use you as an example, either good or bad. So those are kind of my 4 or 5 things that people really need to think about before they get into this.
Right. Sounds fairly intrusive.
It is. It is.
Yeah.
So some upcoming dates, I think we've covered these. June 9th is when the FCC is going to be voting on the final auction procedures. The draft is available. There will be some changes. I don't expect there will be major changes, but I do think some companies will be pushing for that. June 15th is when we should see the auction application tutorial, maybe even before then. That'll be available on the FCC's webpage, which is fcc.gov/auction/904. That's the name of the auction. Sometime around that date, we'll also see the final list of census blocks. The short form window closes at 6 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time on July 15th. There's going to be an auction bidding tutorial available by October 14th. A mock auction 3 days before the auction begins on October 29th. The FCC also will be resolving a few petitions for reconsideration. The cycle of comments just closed on that. I don't think there will be any changes to the existing rules. And the FCC is also going to put a notice out on the electronic filing procedures that we just talked about. So the portal is not open. It'll be open on July 1, probably around midday. And at that point, you can start, browsing through the short form application, figuring out what attachments you need to upload and how that all works. You can keep updating your application until the window closes on July 15th. You don't have to sort of submit one time and be done. So the good thing is you can keep tweaking it until you're done. It will take short form. It's not really short. It's a pretty long exercise. I would make sure that you go over everything first, figure out what you need. Keep your circle small, meaning if you're bidding in this, you probably want to have a locked access war room that only a few people can access, so that you are not inadvertently violating those anti-collusion rules.
Right.
So I think that's the end of the slides. There's probably just a closing slide that you might want to turn to, but I know you've got some more questions.
So at this point, you don't anticipate any major changes or any significant delays?
I do not. The only thing, I think the dates are set. I think the only thing that really could be significant is the change between the preliminary list of census blocks that will be eligible for the auction that came out in March versus what the FCC will put out as its final list next month. The FCC has a lot of tough calls to make about whether it should exclude or include certain census blocks. So, and some of those have gotten fairly contentious and political. So we'll see where that all ends up.
Okay. Very good. So any advice for companies? I mean, you've given us a lot of good advice throughout here, but companies thinking about participating, any other advice?
You know, due diligence is the best thing I can always say. Read everything you can about the auction. Read the auction procedures. Read the technical guide, which gives a bunch of scenarios of how the auction might play out under given circumstances. Talk to people who are knowledgeable about this. Try to get a handle on the mapping. Understand, go through all of those questions. They're in Appendix A of those auction procedures that came out on Tuesday, and anticipate how you might answer all the questions. There's 3 pages of questions that are, get into things like what's your spectrum plan, what's your network plan, how do you plan to manage it, so on and so forth. Start talking to your banks about cutting you a letter of credit. All of this is made a little bit more challenging because it's harder to collaborate with people in your office, at least for states that are still under a stay-at-home or stay-away type environment. So just try and learn as much as you can about this, and so that you're going in with your eyes open. That's the best advice I can give anyone. And if you decide that it's just too tough, or some of those things I talked about are just not for you and not for your company and nothing you want to do, at least you will have made an informed decision not to participate, rather than just sort of, regretting later that you should have spent more time investigating the opportunity.
Really good advice, Steve. This is turning into the perfect storm for utilities planning to build out a broadband to the home model. And I mean that in a good way. Right. Historically, the 2 barriers have been funding and spectrum, and RDOF and CBRS addresses both of those concerns. So we're very excited about the program. Our utility clients are very excited. We're hoping for a lot of success, and thanks for a lot of great information today. And everybody else out there, thanks for joining, and until next time, stay safe.